There is a church campus in Stonecrest, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, that most Americans have never heard of by its current name. But almost every American who watched cable news in 2010 remembers what happened there. 25,000 people once filled its sanctuary on a Sunday. Then, in the span of about 2 years, that number was cut by more than half. This is the story of what happened after the cameras left. This is the story of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and the quiet, deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable rebuilding of one of Black America's most famous megachurches under a pastor who was once considered too controversial to be trusted with it. Let's start with the wreckage, because you cannot understand the rebuild without understanding what was broken. New Birth was founded in 1939, and by the 1980s, it had become a modest Atlanta area congregation of a few hundred people. In 1987, a young magnetic preacher named Eddie Long took over the pulpit, and what followed was one of the fastest growth stories in American religious history. Within 4 years, membership exploded from around 150 people to more than 8,000. By the 2000s, New Birth had swelled to roughly 25,000 members, making it one of the largest Black churches in the country, drawing athletes, entertainers, and political figures, and turning Long into a nationally recognized bishop known for his flash, his physique, and his fierce public opposition to same-sex marriage. In 2004, he literally marched to Martin Luther King Jr.'s grave alongside Bernice King to rally support for a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage. It was theater, it was power, and it was, for a long time, wildly effective. Then, in September of 2010, everything changed in a single week. 4 young men filed lawsuits accusing Bishop Long of using his spiritual authority to coerce them into sexual relationships when they were teenagers in the church's youth academy, allegedly showering them with cars, cash, clothes, and international trips. Long denied the allegations from the pulpit in front of thousands of stunned congregants, and the case was eventually settled out of court, with the terms never made fully public. The damage, though, was very public. Sociologists who study American congregations later described it plainly. This was a fall from grace, and the ministry never fully recovered its national reach. Long stayed in the pulpit for several more years, but membership kept sliding, and in January of 2017, he died of an aggressive cancer at the age of 63. The church that once held 25,000 people was down to roughly 10,000, and it needed a new leader almost as badly as it needed to figure out who it even was anymore. The first attempt at a successor didn't stick. Bishop Stephen Davis, who had run a successful satellite congregation for Long in Birmingham, Alabama, stepped in after Long's death, but he resigned in June of 2018. Leaving the largest Black church in Georgia without a permanent pastor for the second time in under 2 years. So the church's board did something unusually deliberate for an institution built on charisma and inheritance. They opened a formal search. 138 candidates applied to lead New Birth. And out of that pool, in November of 2018, the church selected a preacher who, on paper, looked like an odd fit for an institution trying to quiet down its reputation, because he had one of the loudest reputations in Black church culture. That preacher was Dr. Jamal Harrison Bryant. Bryant was born in Boston in 1971 and raised in Baltimore, the son of Bishop John Richard Bryant, a retired senior bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Reverend Cecilia Williams Bryant, an AME, Episcopal supervisor in her own right. In other words, this was not a man discovering ministry late in life. He was, by his own description, a third-generation pastor who preached his first sermon as a child. He attended Morehouse College, earned a Master of Divinity from Duke University, and later a Doctorate of Ministry from the Graduate Theological Foundation. In 2000, at just 29 years old, he founded Empowerment Temple in Baltimore. And over 18 years, he grew that congregation from 47 founding members to roughly 10,000. Along the way, he built a national profile as a civil rights activist, someone who showed up at protests, spoke at funerals of police violence victims, and briefly ran for a U.S. congressional seat in Baltimore in 2015 before suspending that campaign less than 2 weeks after announcing it. He was known, for better or worse, as outspoken, media-savvy, and occasionally controversial in his own right. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that hiring choice was. Megachurch succession in America almost always happens through inheritance or informal anointing. A founding pastor's son takes over, or a hand-picked associate pastor gets elevated without much competition. A formal, board-run search process involving 138 outside applicants looks a lot more like how a Fortune 500 company replaces a chief executive than how most Black Baptist congregations replace a bishop. That alone tells you something about where New Birth's leadership understood themselves to be standing in 2018. Not confident enough to simply anoint an insider, and desperate enough for outside credibility that they were willing to open the process to strangers. So when Bryant walked away from the church he'd built from scratch to take over a congregation still reeling from scandal, people asked him why. His answer, reported at the time, was simple and almost blunt. Because it's New Birth, and there was work to do. He preached his first sermon as pastor-elect on December 9, 2018, and weeks later was formally installed, with Georgia Congressman Hank Johnson, state representatives, and interfaith clergy from across Atlanta all showing up to mark the moment. DeKalb County even declared a Dr. Jamal Harrison Bryant Day. It was a big, loud beginning for a project that would ultimately be defined by something much quieter. Because here's the thing about what Bryant actually did once the installation ceremonies ended. He didn't try to out-spectacle the Eddie Long era. He didn't chase the same scale of celebrity culture that had once defined New Birth's identity. Instead, over the following years, he oversaw a slow, steady pivot toward transparency, mental health, community infrastructure, and generational reinvestment. The kind of work that rarely trends on social media, but fundamentally reshapes what a congregation is for. The clearest example of that shift is something the church calls group therapy. Every Tuesday night, New Birth holds a Bible study under that name, streamed live alongside its Sunday services, and the branding is not accidental. Traditional megachurch culture, especially in the Long era, rewarded performance, the perfect suit, the flawless testimony, the untouchable bishop on stage. Bryant's Tuesday sessions lean deliberately in the opposite direction, framing scripture study as a space for emotional honesty, for talking through personal struggle, healing, and what he often calls a wilderness season, rather than pretending pastors and congregants alike have it all figured out. It's a small format shift, 1 hour, 1 night a week. But it signals something bigger. An institution that had been humiliated by a leader's secrecy was now explicitly building its culture around vulnerability instead. And it hasn't stayed a niche offering tucked away on a weeknight. Group therapy is live-streamed on the same platforms as Sunday worship, meaning anyone scrolling past New Birth's channel encounters the emotionally exposed. Group counseling version of the ministry just as easily as the polished Sunday production. For a church whose most famous public moment was a bishop standing in front of thousands, flatly refusing to address specifics of the allegations against him, choosing to make midweek vulnerability one of its most visible offerings is not a subtle statement. It's closer to an institutional apology, delivered not in words, but in format. This kind of quiet, therapeutic adjacent reprogramming is also part of a broader shift happening across Black megachurch culture more generally. As a generation of pastors who grew up watching the Eddie Long collapse, and others like it, try to build institutions that are less dependent on a single, untouchable figure at the center. Bryant is not the only prominent pastor experimenting with therapy-branded content or mental health messaging from the pulpit, but the scale and consistency of group therapy at New Birth specifically has made it one of the more closely watched examples of the trend, precisely because of how directly it contrasts with what came before it in that exact sanctuary. The second pillar of this quiet transformation is food. And the numbers here are almost hard to believe. In January of 2020, just weeks before the world had ever heard of COVID-19, New Birth quietly launched a ministry called the King's Table, initially serving a few hundred families a month out of the church's campus in Stonecrest. Then, the pandemic hit, and within about a week of the outbreak being declared, weekly distributions were drawing thousands of cars lining up on a Saturday morning. The program was designated an essential service provider by the Department of Homeland Security and Georgia's Emergency Management Agency, which allowed it to keep operating throughout lockdowns. Dr. Bryant partnered with more than 100 faith-based organizations across Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and the Carolinas to widen the reach far beyond the church's own parking lot. By October of 2022, the King's Table had served its 1 millionth person, an achievement the church marked with a documentary called Road to 1 Million and a public celebration that included handing a surprised community member a $1,000 check on the spot. As of recent reporting, that number has climbed past 1.4 million individuals served. With the pantry still running twice a month, every first and third Saturday, distributing fresh produce, meats, and pantry staples. And this hasn't stopped being relevant only during emergencies. As recently as the fall of 2025, during a federal shutdown that paused food assistance benefits for furloughed workers and low-income families, New Birth ran special distribution events specifically to fill that gap, with Bryant telling local reporters that when government systems stall, the church cannot afford to remain silent. The third pillar is about looking forward rather than just patching present-day wounds, and it shows up most clearly in two initiatives: scholarships and youth publishing. Over roughly the past 5 years, New Birth has distributed close to $4 million in scholarships to more than 500 students, a direct investment in getting young people from the community through college without the debt load that defines so much of the modern Black middle-class experience. And on the more unusual end of the spectrum, the church runs something called the Next Gen Story Lab, a program that takes children and teenagers in the congregation through the process of actually writing and publishing their own books. The church has held live book celebration events where more than a dozen young authors from the congregation sign copies of their own published work for church members after Sunday service. It's a small program in terms of headcount, but symbolically it's significant. A church once defined by one man's singular, dominating charisma is now actively building a pipeline of dozens of other voices, some of them not even old enough to drive. There's also an economic development layer to this that has picked up real momentum recently. New Birth has hosted an event called the Bullseye Black Market, a large-scale shopping and vendor showcase that has featured roughly 400 Black-owned businesses across multiple weekends, giving small entrepreneurs a platform and customer base that would be almost impossible for them to access on their own. The church has also partnered with organizations like Operation Hope and joined a broader national push known as the 1 Million Black Businesses Campaign, which aims to help launch 1 million new Black-owned businesses by the year 2030. And most ambitiously, the church recently announced New Birth Village, a housing initiative designed to bring more than 390 homes to the region for middle-class Black families, specifically the group that often earns too much to qualify for subsidized housing, but still finds itself priced out of ownership in a rapidly gentrifying Atlanta metro. The church is contributing roughly 35 acres of its own debt-free campus land to the project, essentially converting real estate that once symbolized a mega ministry scale into a direct mechanism for generational wealth building among its members and neighbors. Think about what that actually represents for a moment. During the Eddie Long era, New Birth's sprawling campus and its enormous land holdings were, functionally, symbols of one man's personal empire, evidence of a ministry so large and so wealthy that its leader could be gifted a multi-million-dollar estate through a charity that named him its own biggest beneficiary. Under Bryant, that same land is being repurposed, quite literally subdivided, to put working and middle-class Black families into homes they actually own. It's hard to imagine a more direct rebuttal to the excesses of the previous era than turning the pastor's old flex, acreage as a monument to personal power, into acreage as a mechanism for other people's equity. None of this means the church has become a place without friction or controversy, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. In late 2022, Bryant made national headlines, not for a scholarship program or a food drive, but for telling a podcast host that he wanted New Birth, which he described as the largest Black land-owning church in America, to explore growing cannabis on its property as a way to draw in Black men who don't typically attend church but might respond to an unconventional, entrepreneurial pitch. It was a classic Bryant move, provocative, headline-generating, and instantly polarizing, even inside his own congregation. It's a reminder that the quiet in this transformation doesn't mean Bryant has become a quiet man. He remains a media-fluent, activist-minded, occasionally provocative public figure, active on social media, still engaged in national civil rights campaigns, including a recent boycott push targeting a major retail chain over its treatment of Black professionals. What's changed isn't his personality. What's changed is the machinery underneath the personality, the food pantry, the scholarship fund, the housing pipeline, the weekly mental health space, all the unglamorous recurring infrastructure that keeps functioning whether or not a given sermon goes viral that week. In November of 2023, the church even opened a community medical clinic inside its own fitness center, offering basic health screenings and services to a surrounding community where access to affordable healthcare is often limited. And on a more personal note, Bryant remarried in 2024 to Dr. Carrie Turner, a moment the church's own communications described as ushering in fresh vision for the ministry's future, a small sign that the man rebuilding this institution has also been rebuilding pieces of his own life in parallel. So what does all of this actually add up to? It's tempting to tell this story as a simple redemption arc. Broken church, disgraced bishop, new pastor rides in. Problem solved. But that framing undersells what's actually interesting here, which is how unglamorous most of the real fix has been. There was no single dramatic sermon that undid the damage of the Eddie Long years. There was no viral moment that rebuilt trust with 15,000 members who walked away. What rebuilt New Birth, to the extent it has been rebuilt, was a Tuesday night Bible study that made room for people's pain instead of demanding their performance. It was a food pantry that started with 300 families and quietly scaled into one of the largest church-run hunger relief operations in the Southeast. It was scholarship checks and self-published children's books and vendor tables at a Black business market and, eventually, houses that families could actually own. None of it trended the way the scandal did. All of it arguably matters more. That's really the lesson sitting underneath this whole story, whether or not you have any connection to New Birth, to Atlanta, or to Black church culture at all. Institutions that get famous for scandal rarely get to choose how the world remembers the crisis. But they do get to choose what they build in the years afterward, quietly, deliberately, one Tuesday night, one Saturday food line, one scholarship check at a time. And sometimes the most consequential transformation isn't the one that makes headlines. It's the one that just keeps showing up, week after week, long after everyone stopped watching. If this kind of deep dive into modern faith institutions, community rebuilding, and the people navigating both public failure and quiet reinvention is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories like this coming. And if you have thoughts on what a real institutional comeback should look like, drop them in the comments, because this conversation is far from over.